First, I want to thank Don and the University of Laval and the Morin Center, and I think Kathleen played a role in organizing this too, for this wonderful conference and for gathering us all together here on this important theme toward a phenomenological ethics. So my talk today will be focused on feminist phenomenology as a critical phenomenology that can make important contributions to the project of a phenomenological ethics. So its title is Cultivating a Critical Natural Attitude. So let me start with an introduction. Phenomenology, which seeks to provide comprehensive descriptions of our lived experience without relying on taken for granted presuppositions and or value judgments about that experience, has proven to be a very productive methodology for feminist philosophers, who, in turn, are significantly advancing and transforming the field. Like traditional Husserlian phenomenology, feminist phenomenology takes as its subject matter everyday human experiences, yet feminist phenomenologists also critique the phenomenological tradition for falsely assuming that gender-neutral and race-neutral descriptions of our lived experiences are possible or even desirable. Feminist phenomenology itself can be said to have burst onto the philosophical scene with the publication of Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, Le Deuxième Sexe, in 1949. Given Beauvoir's intensive study of Husserlian phenomenology, it is no coincidence that the second volume of this groundbreaking text bears the phenomenological title Lived Experience, L'expérience vécue. And yet, in contrast to Husserl's own project, the lived experiences Beauvoir focuses on are not intended to be universal, but rather concern the distinctively gendered experiences associated with being a woman, or, to use Beauvoir's words, the second sex, in a patriarchal society in which white men's lived experiences have been presupposed, even within traditional phenomenology, as the universal norm. Accordingly, in this volume, Beauvoir offers detailed accounts of significant developmental periods in women's lives, ranging from childhood to old age, as well as rich descriptions of the diverse and often denigrated identities women have both voluntarily and involuntarily assumed as lesbians, mothers, prostitutes, narcissists, mystics, women in love, and independent women. Though other 20th century phenomenologists, such as Maurice Merleau-Ponty, challenge Husserl's idealistic portrayal of phenomenology as a presuppositionless or unbiased philosophy that provides essential descriptions of the things themselves, with Merleau-Ponty famously arguing in the preface to his 1945 Phenomenology of Perception that the most important lesson of the phenomenological reduction is the impossibility of a complete reduction. Feminist phenomenologists have challenged even more than the possibility of providing a complete description of a given phenomenon from a reduced or unbiased perspective. Indeed, following Beauvoir's lead, one of our central missions has been to expand radically the types of phenomena that are deemed worthy of serious philosophical attention. Beauvoir's mid-20th century descriptions of the pervasive effects of a sexist society on women's lived experiences provide a crucial foundation for the major contributions feminist phenomenologists Iris Marion Young, Judith Butler, and Sandra Barkey made to the field in the 1970s, 1980s, and early 1990s. All three express their indebtedness to Beauvoir in their work, even as they critique aspects of her account of women's immanence under patriarchy in the second sex. Young's 1980 essay, Throwing Like a Girl, A Phenomenology of Feminine Body Comportment, Motility, and Spatiality. Butler's 1989 essay, Gendering the Body, Beauvoir's Philosophical Contribution. Her 1990 monograph, Gender Trouble, Gender and the Subversion of Identity. And Barkey's 1990 volume, Femininity and Domination, Studies in the Phenomenology of Oppression, have in turn become classics in the field, establishing a canon that continues to inspire new generations of feminist phenomenologists. Early 21st century feminist phenomenology has also been marked by an insistence, contra Husserl, that phenomenological investigations should not aim to be non-prescriptive and value-free. Indeed, contemporary feminist phenomenologists are using the tools of phenomenological description to reveal the urgent social, political, and ethical consequences of assuming that the experiences of privileged, white, able-bodied, heterosexual, cisgendered males constitute the ideal norm. Drawing upon key insights from critical race theory, prison studies, disability studies, and queer theory, contemporary feminist phenomenologists continue to chart new ground through their contributions to what Lisa Gunther and others are calling critical phenomenology. Like traditional phenomenology, Gunther observes, critical phenomenology is, quote, a method that is rooted in first-person accounts of experience, unquote. However, it is, quote, also critical of classical phenomenology's claim that the first-person singular is absolutely prior to intersubjectivity and the complex textures of social life, end quote. To insist that subjectivity is intersubjectively constituted is to affirm that our first-person perspectives are not generated in a vacuum. Rather, they are developed in and through our everyday relations with others, relations that are situated within and structured by a broader social, cultural, political, economic, and historical context. Given that one individual's subjective perspective always already incorporates the perspectives of others, it is impossible to describe a single individual's experience as if it is totally separate from the experiences of other members of her community, or as if it is immune to the influence of the habitus, to use Pierre Bourdieu's expression, that reflects the established norms of that community. Taking seriously Husserl's emphasis upon the background horizons that contextualize each and every human experience, as well as the perspectives we form based on that experience, critical feminist phenomenologists call attention to the sexist, racist, and ableist contexts in which our experiences and our understanding of our experiences so often unfold. Contexts that tend to remain invisible and unexamined unless the habitual expectations that they give rise to are challenged in some way. Feminist phenomenology, moreover, is not content merely to describe the habitual expectations that reflect and reinforce what is so often an unjust and oppressive status quo, but seeks to problematize and ultimately alter them. So this section is called Early Interventions in Feminist Phenomenology, Beauvoir, Young, Barkey, and Butler. It is impossible to overestimate the crucial contributions the four authors I've just mentioned have made to the development of feminist phenomenology as a legitimate research specialization in its own right. Building upon Beauvoir's detailed descriptions of how women are socialized to accept the daily devaluation of their minds and bodies under patriarchy, Young, Barkey, and Butler each expose the deleterious consequences of buying into what Beauvoir calls the myth of woman, namely a false, fixed, and ultimately contradictory set of stereotypes about women that legitimizes their second-class status in society as man's inferior by presenting this latter as their natural destiny. And I think we just heard that talk about that with Charge Mentop. In Beauvoir's words, quote, this idea escapes all contention because it is situated beyond the given. This is the myth of woman. It is endowed with an absolute truth. Thus, to the dispersed, contingent, and multiple existence of women, mythic thinking opposes the eternal feminine, unique and fixed. If the definition given is contradicted by the behavior of real flesh and blood women, it is women who are wrong. Experiential denials cannot do anything against the myth, unquote. Instead of acknowledging and embracing the actual diversity of women's experiences and aspirations, the myth of woman conflates women with femininity and offers a very restricted view of the type of behavior that counts as appropriate feminine conduct. Those of us who fail to meet these accepted standards, as we all do from time to time, even if we are trying our best to live up to them, tend to be judged harshly by other members of society, especially by our female peers, who might lament or perhaps note with glee that we have let ourselves go. This social condemnation, moreover, is often reinforced by a woman's overly critical self-assessments of her own appearance. At the beginning of her essay, Women Recovering Our Clothes, Iris Young offers a poignant description of the complex yet mundane experience of a woman trying on clothes who does not simply see herself in the mirror, but also sees herself being seen, whether by a real or imagined male observer. Quote, "I am seeing myself in wool, seeing him see me," she observes, and then quickly asks, quote, "Is it that I cannot see myself without seeing myself being seen? So I need him there to unite me and my image of myself? Who does he think I am?" Unquote. This experience of being a split subject, she calls it, a woman whose view of herself is mediated by the way she imagines she is being viewed by another who judges her and may find her wanting, Young suggests, is quite familiar to women in a patriarchal society. Despite its tongue-in-cheek title, Women Recovering Our Clothes, this essay demands that we give women's relationship to their clothes and to the men who judge how they look in them our serious phenomenological attention. As Butler emphasizes, the penalties for, as she says, doing one's gender wrong, that is, for violating the formal and informal standards that sharply distinguish proper masculine from proper feminine conduct, have historically included not only verbal and physical abuse and or social ostracization, but also death. Quote, "One does not become a gender through a free and unconstrained act of choice," she observes, "for gender identity is governed by a set of stringent taboos, conventions, and laws. There are punishments for not doing gender right. A man in Maine walks down the street in a dress, walking the way that women are supposed to walk. Next day, his body is found dead in a ravine. And though we may not have experienced his punishment directly, although much of child rearing is involved in inculcating the rules of gender through the fear of punishment, we nevertheless know something of the terror and shame of being told that we are somehow doing our gender wrong, that we have failed in some way to measure up to the cultural norm and expectation." Unquote. Young and Barkey provide additional examples of the harmful gender policing that women are subjected to from their earliest youth, including powerful autobiographical accounts of the negative psychical and physical effects that result from sexist socialization practices that discourage girls, but not boys, from maximizing their bodily potentialities. In Throwing Like a Girl, Young points out that, unlike boys who are encouraged to develop their physical capacities to the utmost, young girls have traditionally been dissuaded from engaging in physically challenging tasks for fear that they will get hurt and or appear unladylike. As a result, she notes, women, quote, "have more of a tendency than men do to greatly underestimate our bodily capacity. We decide beforehand, usually mistakenly, that the task is beyond us, and thus give it less than our full effort. At such a half-hearted level, of course, we cannot perform the tasks, become frustrated, and fulfill our own prophecy." End quote. Building upon Young's account, Barkey introduces Marx's concept of alienation to address the long-lasting impact of these self-constraining experiences on women's relationships with their own bodies. More specifically, Barkey asserts that, quote, "just as workers can be alienated from their labor, so can women be estranged from their own sexuality," end quote. Like Young, she exposes a paradoxical dimension to this process, arguing that even as a woman encounters spatial and sexual barriers that can result in a sense of bodily alienation, she also can, quote, "suffer a different form of estrangement by being too closely identified with her body," unquote, through the lived experience of sexual objectification. To be sexually objectified, Barkey maintains, quote, "is to have one's entire being identified with the body, a thing which in many religious and metaphysical systems, as well as in the popular mind, has been regarded as less intrinsically valuable, indeed, as less inherently human than the mind or personality," end quote. In her chapter on psychological oppression, Barkey offers a personal anecdote that perfectly captures this experience of sexual objectification that so often catches one unawares, undermining one's sense of embodied agency in the process. So here's the quote, the story. It is a fine spring day, and with an utter lack of self-consciousness, I am bouncing down the street. Suddenly, I hear men's voices. Catcalls and whistles fill the air. These noises are clearly sexual in intent, and they are meant for me. They come from across the street. I freeze. As Sartre would say, I have been petrified by the gaze of the other. My face flushes, and my motions become stiff and self-conscious. The body, which only a moment before I inhabited with such ease, now floods my consciousness. While it is true for these men, I am nothing but, let us say, a nice piece of ass, there is more involved in this encounter than their mere fragmented perception of me. They could, after all, have enjoyed me in silence. Blissfully unaware, breasts bouncing, eyes on the birds in the trees, I could have passed by without having been turned to stone. But I must be made to know that I am a nice piece of ass. I must be made to see myself as they see me. There is an element of compulsion in this encounter, in this being made to be aware of one's own flesh, like being made to apologize. It is humiliating. Unquote. While Barkey emphasizes the element of compulsion that is part and parcel of the experience of being treated merely as a nice piece of ass, she also recognizes, like Beauvoir, Young, and Butler, that sexual harassment is not the only way in which women's bodies are objectified. Given that, as Adrienne Rich observes, every human being, whether male or female, is of woman born, it is no surprise that the ability to bear children has long been regarded as one of the most important sources of women's value in a patriarchal society. While pregnant women commonly experience unwanted stares, inappropriate questions, and even intrusive patting of their bodies by total strangers, this form of bodily objectification tends not to be regarded as a form of sexual objectification because, as Young notes, quote, our own culture harshly separates pregnancy from sexuality, unquote. Women who cannot or choose not to have children do not escape notice, but are also objectified for failing to use their bodies to fulfill the maternal role that has been regarded for centuries as a woman's highest calling. Indeed, they are often regarded as more selfish and more tragic than other women, not only by men, but also by other women, especially mothers. Women who are not mothers, moreover, are not exempt from the caregiving expectations that accompany our idealized conceptions of motherhood, since, as Barkey astutely observes, the task of providing daily emotional support to others, especially to the men they live and or work with, has traditionally fallen upon women. In her aptly titled chapter, Feeding Egos and Tending Wounds, Barkey describes this often invisible but very time-consuming and energy-depleting form of affective labor as follows, quote, to support someone emotionally is to keep up his spirits, to keep him from sinking under the weight of burdens that are his to bear. And she adds, to give such support, then, is to tend to a person's state of mind in such a way as to make his sinking less likely. It is to offer him comfort, typically by the bandaging up of his emotional wounds, or to offer him sustenance, typically by the feeding of his self-esteem. The aim of this supporting and sustaining is to produce or to maintain in the one supported and sustained a conviction of the value and importance of his own chosen projects, hence of the value and importance of his own person, unquote. Propping up other people's self-esteem so that they can continue to feel good about themselves, even in the face of personal or professional failures, can be seen as a unique form of consciousness raising that, in marked contrast to early feminist consciousness raising, which seeks to leave no woman behind, far too often raises a man's consciousness at the expense of the woman who supports him. As Barkey's description that I just read makes clear, this traditionally feminine labor goes far beyond emotional support. since it is not merely real as well as symbolic wounds that are tended to, but male egos that are fed. By calling our attention to the sexist as well as racist, classist, and ableist socialization practices that have consigned both men and women to mutually exclusive, oppositional roles that permit very little deviation or variation without the risk of severe social penalty, feminist phenomenologists have challenged the universality of human experience that is presupposed by the male philosophers whose works are most closely associated with the phenomenological canon. The grand titles of these latter texts that we know so well, including Husserl's Ideas Pertaining to a Pure Phenomenology and to a Phenomenological Philosophy, Heidegger's Being in Time, Sartre's Being in Nothingness, and Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception, testify to their authors' confident shared presumption that consciousness, being, time, nothingness, and perception are experienced similarly by all of us, and hence that essential descriptions can be provided of these lived realities that hold equally true for every human being. Yet this is precisely the presupposition that is contested by feminist phenomenologists who describe the ways in which a person's gender, race, social class, and bodily abilities affect her relations with others, and therefore the meaning of her lived experience. Indeed, the very titles of Beauvoir's, Barkey's, and Young's books, The Second Sex, Gender Trouble, Femininity and Nomination, Studies in the Phenomenology of Oppression, and On Female Embodiment, Throwing Like a Girl, and other essays, signal their rejection of decontextualized discourses about what are assumed to be essential features of human existence. Rather than viewing their respective critiques of the phenomenological tradition as a rejection of its commitment to provide a comprehensive, rigorous, clear-sighted, and accurate description of lived experience, however, I would argue that feminist phenomenologists are actually taking this commitment even more seriously, perhaps, than their male predecessors. Indeed, as these feminist phenomenologists so eloquently and forcefully remind us, the phenomenological descriptions we provide must express the actual realities of our lives. Accomplishing this latter goal, moreover, requires a critical phenomenology that is attuned to the sexist, racist, and ableist presuppositions about human consciousness, perception, temporality, and intersubjectivity that oppress so many and have historically benefited so few. In particular, as Sarah Ahmed observes, a feminist approach, quote, is necessary because of what has not ended: sexism, sexual exploitation, and sexual oppression, end quote. Indeed, as feminist phenomenologists well recognize, these unjust facts of life cannot be swept to the side or deemed irrelevant as we seek to describe the essential features of our lived experience. They must be included in our accounts even as we aim, by identifying them, to open up new possibilities for women and minorities that histories of sexism, racism, ableism, and classism have all too often foreclosed. As Dorothy Olkowski concludes in her 1999 essay on feminism and phenomenology, quote, if there is an ongoing task attributable to feminist phenomenology, it is this: to transform the culture in the direction of greater openness toward the diversity of life and body, such that the embodied subject is recognized as gendered and historically conditioned, open to all the tensions and contradictions of the culture in which she lives, thus also open to political and personal transformation. This section is called Transforming the Natural Attitude, the Task of Feminist Phenomenology. There is a synthetic and organic quality to feminist phenomenology that differentiates it from the phenomenological tradition out of which it arose. Whereas the well-known authors whose work has historically defined the phenomenological canon, Husserl, Heidegger, Sartre, and Merleau-Ponty in particular, each claim to be providing us with a description of the most essential features of human existence, and frequently begin with an agonistic critique of previous accounts as inadequate to the current task, the work of feminist phenomenologists is marked by a creative engagement with other feminist philosophers' insights, producing a more collaborative canon in the process, albeit one that remains open to critique and contestation. In contrast to the dispassionate descriptions of allegedly universal, non-gendered, and non-racialized experiences that have long defined the phenomenological tradition, feminist phenomenology, as noted earlier, has a clear social, political, and ethical agenda. By eschewing uncritical claims to universality, our more nuanced and thick descriptions seek not only to address, but also to redress long histories of discrimination and oppression that have led to the devaluation of the lived experiences of women and minorities. Contemporary feminist phenomenologists are well aware of the debt we owe to our feminist foremothers, as well as to the phenomenological tradition itself, which has provided a vocabulary and a method that continues to yield rich insights, especially when one focuses on describing experiences of difference rather than sameness. As Ahmed notes, quote, citation is feminist memory. Citation is how we acknowledge our debt to those who came before, those who helped us find our way when the way was obscured because we deviated from the paths we were told to follow, unquote. By actively citing the work of other feminist phenomenologists, we have been able to establish our own feminist canon that preserves and highlights the different perspectives out of which it has emerged. While the early work of feminist phenomenologists such as Beauvoir, Barkey, Young, and Butler tended to focus on gender and sexual difference, contemporary feminist phenomenology is marked by a more intersectional approach that increasingly incorporates key insights from critical race theory, queer theory, decolonial theory, and disability studies. A powerful example of how a classic phenomenological description can be revisited and presented in a wholly new light through an intersectional feminist lens is provided by Ahmed in her 2006 monograph, Queer Phenomenology. A central leitmotif in the book is Husserl's example from Ideas Volume 1 of sitting at the table in his study writing and then stopping for a moment to survey the room, look outside the window, and listen to the voices of the children playing in the garden outside. Husserl uses this example to discuss the figure ground structure of perception and the way in which our focus on a particular noema, or perceptual object, pushes everything else into the background. While one is absorbed in a concrete task, he suggests, one can remain blithely unaware of one's immediate environs as well as the activities that are presently going on within one's perceptual field. When one changes one's perspective, however, and attends to one's surroundings, the table one is writing on, the window above the desk that offers a view of the garden, and the children playing outside are transformed from the ground to the figure, becoming the new focus of one's awareness. This perceptual inversion of figure to ground and ground to figure in turn reveals the complex, multiple horizons that play an ongoing, yet often invisible role in establishing the sphere of our daily concern. Ahmed is both fascinated and troubled by this account of perceptual orientation. Dwelling at length on this mundane examples, she asks decidedly non-Husserlian questions about the motivations that lead us to adopt one orientation rather than another, opening up new phenomenological terrain in the process. While Husserl's example is intended to be a neutral account of how we can alter our focus from what we are writing to the actual paper on which it is being written, or the table on which the paper lies, or the garden outside the window, Ahmed invites us, quote, to consider the domestic work that must have taken place for Husserl to turn to the writing table and to be writing on the table and to keep that table as the object of his attention, end quote. Invoking Charlotte Perkins Gilman, she adds, quote, we can draw here on the long history of feminist scholarship about the politics of housework, about the ways in which women, as wives and servants, do the work required to keep such spaces available for men and the work they do. To sustain an orientation toward the writing table might depend on such work, while it erases the signs of such work, of that work, as signs of dependence, end quote. Suddenly, through Ahmed's own writing, a new orientation and hence a new figure appears. Husserl's seemingly innocuous example, intended to showcase the essential figure ground structure of all perceptual experience, recedes into the background, revealing in turn what has not hitherto been visible but was there all along, namely his gender and class privilege. Indeed, as Ahmed convincingly demonstrates, The writing table and the room were never neutral objects to begin with, but a gendered space that Husserl can be productive in only if other people, for example, women, are taking care of the house and children so that he is free to write and reflect on his experience. Ahmed's provocative and illuminating discussion reveals an abiding theme in feminist phenomenology more generally. Its insistence upon not accepting traditional descriptions at face value, but probing further to uncover the hidden gendered, racial, sexual, and class presuppositions that operate beneath the surface and that must remain hidden in order for these examples to function as universal experiences available to all. Contemporary phenomenologists such as Linda Martín Alcoff, Mariana Ortega, and Gail Solomon continue to break new ground by offering descriptions of experiences that, like the women taking care of Husserl's house, have been there all along, but which have not hitherto been deemed worthy of phenomenological attention. Their phenomenologies of mixed race, multiplicitous, and trans identities are only 3 examples of the exciting work that is currently being done in our field, work that is inspiring new generations of feminist phenomenologists to boldly go where no man has gone before. Having sketched out in fairly broad strokes, this is my final section, what I take to be the ethical promise of feminist phenomenology, a key question that remains concerns the concrete implications of its critical methodology for our own natural attitudes. Attitudes that, as Husserl's own account makes clear, and as I and other feminist phenomenologists have emphasized, are clearly not natural, but arise in and through the socialization process that begins at birth. Indeed, our own natural attitudes never arise ex nihilo, but are profoundly influenced by the specific people, places, time, culture, and history that constitute the horizons out of which they emerge. Thus, there is no one generic or universal natural attitude for Husserl that we all share. And yet, despite the inevitable differences that distinguish my own natural attitude from that of others, and that also distinguish my natural attitude when I am a young child from my natural attitude as an adult, what does seem to remain consistent about the natural attitude, its hallmark as it were, is that it tends to be naturalized and normalized. To say that our natural attitudes are naturalized and normalized suggests that they provide an almost invisible standard against which we define what is viewed as unnatural, abnormal, extraordinary, or unusual. Their naturalization and normalization, in turn, are precisely why they tend to function normatively in our everyday lives. In an article entitled Bodies and Sensings on the Uses of Husserlian Phenomenology for Feminist Theory, Alia Al-Saji suggests that, quote, rather than locating shared or normalized structures, the critical role of the reduction may be its ability to uncover the naturalization of what are taken to be normal ways of living, unquote. For if it is the case, as she notes in another essay, that, quote, through repetition and habituation, a particular order of difference and meaning becomes norm, a certain level becomes the level, according to which we see, receiving itself from visibility, end quote, then the phenomenological reduction is precisely what can make this process itself visible. While Husserl also emphasizes the crucial philosophical insights that we acquire when we suspend our natural attitudes, and also implies that the suspension provides us with a better understanding of how our natural attitudes provide a relatively stable framework for interpreting the events that take place in our everyday lives, he does not discuss the transformative effect the suspension of the natural attitude can have upon our natural attitudes themselves. To address this latter point, perhaps, would have led Husserl to a domain he rules out from the start, namely to ethical questions regarding the actual views that comprise our natural attitudes, views that shape how we understand ourselves, others, and the world that we share, most often without our explicit awareness. The specific ethical issue that I and other feminist phenomenologists, as well as critical race theorists and disability theorists, are especially interested in fact, is one that Husserl never raises, but that is indebted to his own analysis of the ubiquity and profound influence of our not-so-natural attitudes on our lives. Namely, how can phenomenology aid us in the effort not only to identify, but also to alter racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, ableist, and classist natural attitudes in ourselves and others. While Husserl seemed to be satisfied with the substantial philosophical rewards that phenomenology could provide through its comprehensive description of specific phenomena that, like the natural attitude itself, are often unnoticed, even as they play a constitutive role in establishing the normalcy of our experiences and expectations. Feminist theorists, critical race theorists, and disability theorists are not content to restrict ourselves to bringing these previously unexamined phenomena to our attention, even as we recognize that clear-sighted descriptions of these phenomena is where we must necessarily begin. Indeed, as I noted earlier, we want to put these descriptions to work, using them to identify injustices and exclusions that, as we are collectively claiming, demand an ethical response. And it is the possibility of cultivating the latter response, even and especially when it promises to destabilize our natural attitudes by forcing us to be attuned to their oppressive effects, that motivates much of the work that we do. In Living a Feminist Life, Ahmed succinctly observes, quote, "Once you become a person who notices sexism and racism, it is hard to unbecome that person," unquote. In this brief assertion, she beautifully captures the power of a critical phenomenology that is attuned to phenomena that escape the attention of classical phenomenologists, yet which also enable the latter to do phenomenology without having to worry about defending their right to do it because their race or sex or disability was seen as disqualifying them from having legitimate philosophical insights. Through her own interrogation of the various straightening devices, as she calls them, that reinforce heterosexist norms and therefore heterosexist natural attitudes, Ahmed reveals that even seemingly innocuous objects, like Husserl's own writing desk or the family dinner table, are saturated with complex, sedimented habits and histories that actively support some people's projects at the expense of others. Thus, while Husserl emphasizes the importance of providing comprehensive descriptions of what appears to consciousness through the phenomenological reduction, Ahmed challenges us not to restrict ourselves, or phenomenology for that matter, simply to an interrogation of what appears. In her words, quote, "In the face of what appears, we must ask what disappears," end quote. And it is becoming attuned to who or what disappears when certain people, relationships, objects, institutions, and places so readily appear. That is, in becoming attuned to the omissions and tensions within our own natural attitudes, that we can best cultivate what I am calling a critical natural attitude, or what Al-Saji calls a critical ethical vision. Addressing what such a perspective can teach us, Al-Saji notes that, quote, "An anti-racist vision can learn to see the conditions, material, historical, social, and discursive, of racializing perception. A feminist vision can see the ways in which bodies have been gendered and the exclusions and occlusions of complex difference that this has entailed," end quote. For Al-Saji, these new perspectives cannot be efficacious only when we suspend our natural attitudes, even if that is when they are most likely to come into view. Rather, they have the power to transform our natural attitudes, enabling us, as Al-Saji and Linda Alcoff maintain, to learn to see better. And I would add, if we learn to see better, to be attuned to what is rendered invisible when other things are rendered visible, we will certainly be better people as well as better phenomenologists. Thank you.